started at least the intro. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Please let me know in the chat if you're having any technical difficulties. I can try to resolve them for you. For any questions that you have, please submit them via the chat. This program is made possible in partnership with LexSeeHer and the League of Women Voters, as well as the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation. I'd like to now introduce the speaker for this evening, Professor Lisa Levenstein. She is the director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at University of North Carolina at Greensboro, as well as professor of history there. She specializes in 20th century US women's and gender history. She's the author of 2 books, A Movement Without Marches, African-American Women and the Politics of Poverty in Post-War Philadelphia. And the topic of tonight's talk, They Didn't See Us Coming, The Hidden History of Feminism in the 90s. I'd also like to introduce the host and moderator of tonight's program, Jessie Steigerwald. Jessie is the president of LexSeeHer and wears many hats in Lexington, including being an avid community organizer, working with the arts, writing for the Lexington Minutemen, being a town meeting member, and much more. So now please welcome Lisa Levenstein and Jessie Steigerwald.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for supporting tonight's event as well, and for all the library donors. Lisa, it is delightful to meet you. Hello.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Matt for the invitation. And Jessie, thank you for hosting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I'm holding up your book, which I have enjoyed enormously. I'm sorry, here, let me do that so people can see it. When I first got the email about your book and I saw They Didn't See Us Coming, I was like, oh no, I'm not good at scary things. But then I saw The Hidden History of Feminism in the 90s and I thought, that's not scary, that's awesome. So first, great title. And for those who are listening, just want to let you know what we're hoping is Lisa and I are going to start a conversation. We would love to see people thinking about what we're talking about and sharing ideas, questions, comments in the chat bar. In this beginning part, I won't be able to watch the chat bar, but if you hear something, please go ahead and put your questions in so you don't lose track of them. And then we'll weave in people to this conversation. So I just wanted to start by letting people know who haven't had a chance yet to read the book, and I highly recommend this book. Lexington's a very active place. In fact, tonight is town meeting, and we have a lot of people who act locally. And it got me thinking when I was reading your book, this phrase, think globally, act locally. And there's so many different ways people in Lexington have employed this, thinking about sustainability, setting policies that might seem like small changes, but they're in the right direction towards global impacts. So then I was thinking about how you set this study looking at the United Nations sponsored Fourth World Conference on Women and the global setting where a lot of women who had done local activism end up going. Can you set the stage for people to understand what are we going to be talking about? Where did you center and why did you center on this conference?
Thanks, what a great beginning. So I think like many people, although I'd be really interested to see about the audience, what your experiences were, but my experience of the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China in 1995 was filtered largely through the media. And I think that was true for many people who lived in the US. And the media talked about the fact that Hillary Clinton, right, then First Lady, went to the conference. There was kind of some debate about whether she would go or not, but she ended up going and she delivered, you know, what by all accounts was just like a tremendous speech about where she says, you know, women's rights are human rights. And that got just such tremendous media attention, this speech, and it was kind of a moment for her. She'd come off the healthcare debacle, you know, and she, you know, kind of redeemed herself in a certain sense. And so there was a lot of pride about this speech as she delivers it in China. You know, this was kind of what I understood to be the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. And then I came across an article. I was doing kind of research on something else, and I came across an article from the time that listed all of these grassroots organizations, feminist organizations, women's organizations. There might have been one from Lexington for all I know. Many of them were actually women of color organizations. Some of them I was familiar with from other research and just knowledge that had attended the conference. And I was like, what's that about, right? All of these groups were there, and I started digging in. And I started to learn about the fact that there's the official government conference, but then there's the NGO forum that is, paired with these UN conferences where the activists go. And that the one in Beijing had over 40,000 people. It was essentially a global feminist conference, celebration, networking event. I mean, just this incredible experience. And the more I started digging into that conference, the more I realized how important it was for many different groups of feminists, women's organizations who were active in the 1990s, actually whether they went or not, right? Because part of the obligation, if you were one of the ones who managed to raise money to go or managed to get there, almost everyone who went then did some kind of programming back in the US when they came back, right? The idea was like, we've gotten all of this incredible information and energy and ideas from being around all of these activists from other parts of the world, and we've learned all these things. We need to bring that back home. And so almost, so it was really a very important event in the history of the feminist movement, which then of course made me think, well, if I didn't know about that, what else don't I know about that happened in the 90s? And that kind of started the research for this book.
People can definitely use a chat bar. I know for Lexington has a lot of community members who are actually from China who travel back and forth to see family, or, more frequently. I have not been myself, but for people who are listening and you're kind of traveling back in time, going back to 1995, like not everybody had the same access to technology that we have today. So you set the stage for what was it like if I were in Lexington, let's say, and a really very active feminist person who was doing work with a nonprofit organization. How would I get invited to this conference? Who would pay for my trip? And then what would it be like when I get there?
Yeah, so those are great questions. A lot of people did fundraising to get there. So they would say, okay, we want to send one or two people from our organization, and we're going to do like a lot of fundraising and try to get them there. There was also a lot of foundations in the 90s. I mean, if you think back, I actually did you can do this kind of Google search to find out when words kind of become part of like our lexicon. And the term globalization, it's the 90s, right? So we're beginning to understand and talk about the idea that we're in a global world, the idea that things here are so connected. I mean, it's like we knew this before and people were talking about it, but that term, this idea of being in a globalized world has more kind of cachet. And foundations, many large foundations like the Ford Foundation decided that it was very important for activists and people doing various kinds of social change in the US to become more globally informed, to have a kind of global experience. So they spent a lot of money sending people to the Beijing conference and getting them there. And I mean, I think one of the really interesting parts about that conference is what you're pointing at, Jessie, here, the role of technology. So maybe if we can all think back to when you first kind of used a computer, when you first used email, when you first saw a website. This was the cusp of all of that. And in a certain sense, people had the best of both worlds, because when they were at the conference, they weren't on their phones. No one had a phone. You know what I mean? Like there were a few people who actually had cell phones, but they were like these huge things that they kind of used almost like walkie-talkies, right? That's like kind of where we were at in cell phones right then. It certainly was nothing like a smartphone, right? And so when people were at the conference, like they were there, right? A lot of these panels and plenary sessions took place in big tents, right? And you were just kind of like in this tent with women from other places, other countries, like talking about, sharing strategies. This is what we did, and we got this change, and this is what's happening in our country, and it's really terrible. What can you suggest? You're just kind of like really there. And so that was like an essential part of the conference. Now, there's a second feature to the conference, which was that this was, as I said, the cusp of the digital revolution. And there was also a lot of money and people who were fiercely committed to the idea that feminists needed to get online, that digital communications were the way of the future. Many people had been using faxes in the early 90s. That was the best way to communicate. And so we're really at this moment when people are starting to switch to email. Now, it's not the email that we think of today, like a kind of web-based email. It's the modem-based email. It's using your phone, right? Like scratchy sound and like connecting through your phone. It's that kind of email that people were using. But there was a real sense that email was like the wave of the future, and feminists needed to get on board with it. And so they had at this forum this big Apple computer and IBM, they sent computers. And they had an all-women team. This was very important to the organizers, from like 40 different countries, speaking all kinds of languages, setting up the computers and like kind of serving as like teachers. And people would come in, they would teach them how to use email. They would teach them how to get on the web. And for many people, it was their first time like learning those tools. And it was a really crucial moment in kind of accelerating the process through which feminism got online.
It's so funny because when I was reading it, I had to laugh at the whole experience because, right, for our kids or their kids hanging out in schools now, to really think about what it meant to like plan in your day, when are you going to go get and check that computer? Or I remember having a friend who was like in the fast lane, and I would call on the phone and say, could you look this thing up for me? Or could you send a message for me to this other friend from college? It's such a different time. And you talk about these women coming in from very different places, more rural areas with less access, and how they actually got their first training in how to use the internet or how to use email at all at this particular station. And it was pretty impressive. The woman who set it up brought her kid with her and had to have a babysitter walking around there at the conference. I'm sure people who are listening can identify with like, gotta get your job done. It's out of town. Need to figure out childcare. You painted such a very vivid picture of it. I love though how you explained people were able to stay in touch after the conference because of this. Can you speak a little bit about how you got the information and who you interviewed to get this real, I keep saying it's like a movie in my head. You're so good at explaining it. How did you get this picture of what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, this is another kind of fortuitous thing about studying the 1990s. Well, first of all, I do like, but just one more point about the technology is because I think this was a really interesting move that they made that was very kind of feminist in a certain sense. There was a sense among the people organizing the technology center, organizing to train people on email, that the goal was not to try to do the fanciest thing possible at that time, right? The goal was to expand access to the many rather than focus on like the most like cutting edge tools that only a few people would be able to access. So it was very much like people could do web-based, it was like, we're going to use modems. We're going to use like, just do things in a really basic way, because remember, people are trying to communicate across borders. People are trying to communicate with people in Angola, right? You know what I'm saying? From the US. And also even just within the US at that point, I mean, still today, but even more kind of severely at that time, if you lived in a rural area versus an urban area, your access to email and the web was really different, right? And so there was a real sense that these tools can be powerful, but we don't want the tools to just replicate inequalities that already exist between, rural, urban, developed world, non-developed world, global south, global north. We want these tools. We want to try to spread these tools as much as we can. So that was a real kind of ethos of what they were doing with technology. And as a historian, though, this time is so fortuitous because even though people are communicating on email, and we have like, for example, one of the ways people got information and stayed in touch was through listservs, which were like a new thing, right? You would sign up to be on a listserv. There was a moderator. The moderator would send out various, messages, and like their kind of a conversation would get created. Well, at the time, people were still printing out their emails. And so I would go into the archives and see someone's papers, and there would be just like reams of paper, with the little dots on the side, like the little like holes on the side, like that paper that gets printed out, the cheap paper that comes with, people were printing out. And they print out like weeks or months of a listserv that I then would have as a historical document. I mean, as an aside, trying to archive what's happening right now is
a nightmare.
Whole mess that a lot of archivists are thinking really, and librarians. I mean, I'd be super interested to hear, like how to archive the web, how to archive people's emails, all of this. I mean, the next generation of historians, it's really going to be quite incredible what the kinds of tools they're going to have to use. But I really got lucky because that people were still printing things out. So there are kind of documents to help flesh out, a kind of extensive oral history base that I had.
And I think it helps set the stage for people. And I'm glad we're taking the time to do this, because when you really think about what we're going to cover in the next part of our conversation, where we are now, where one person, one feminist puts out a tweet and it can be seen across the globe, is such a huge contrast. And you and I will get there in our conversation.
Yeah.
But in terms of what women brought to the conference, there was such a wide variety of issues. There were lesbian women who were talking about violence. There were other women talking about violence against women. There were women talking about voter rights. There were people with all kinds of ability challenges who got to the conference and there were no elevators and people were in wheelchairs and they had to carry each other up and down stairs in order to even participate. How did this, like what might be called like single issue feminism, land in the global feminist village? And I'm weaving in a question from the chat bar.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you for that question. The program for this conference, for the NGO Forum, is like a small telephone book. It was over 100 pages of like that very, very small print with all of the different panels and topics. And so the idea was, the kind of theme of the conference was the world through women's eyes. The idea, everyone's probably heard this term, every issue is a feminist issue. It was encapsulated at the conference, right? So there wasn't just like there were the more like things you would think of as like traditional women's issues, right? Sexuality, abortion, violence against women, prostitution, all of those were certainly covered, but as well as like taxes, structural adjustment programs that are happening, welfare reform, so there's just like this incredible breadth and diversity of issues that really showed feminists walking the walk in terms of like every issue is a feminist issue. GDP, huge issue, like how to count women's unpaid labor, right, in GDP. Who's doing it, who's not, how can we get them to do it? Why is this important? All of this. So it was just incredibly, incredibly rich.
It seems like a lot of the women who came from America maybe in some ways thought they were going to be like ahead of the curve because they were from America, and so conditions for women would be better. What happened when they actually got there and started talking to people from other countries?
The key word that they said was humbled. It was unbelievable for many of them. They really did come thinking, things are great, pretty good for women in the US in the 90s, right? Clinton, whatever. And they realized that especially like women from the global South, women from parts of Latin America, Africa, Asia, had been thinking really hard about globalization. They've been thinking really hard about things like, I just said, structural adjustment programs. Most US women didn't even know what that meant, the kinds of policies that were being enacted by the World Bank, the IMF. People, feminists from the US didn't necessarily even know what the World Bank, like why that was important. For these other women, like that was a key institution shaping their lives. And the United States government's involvement in the World Bank was a key issue, that like, how could US feminists not know what their own government was doing and promoting and supporting that was happening around the world? So for a lot of US women, it was like taking notes, right? Like literally at these things, like, wow, one light bulb after another. and that's connected to welfare reform that's happening at home and we've been all engaged in, but like I didn't realize it was happening in other places, and just so it was like light bulbs happening all of the time. And it was really and they had to get up to speed pretty quickly, a lot of them. I mean, those are the ones who had been doing mostly like kind of grassroots work in their own communities. There were also ones who had been involved in this global stuff for a long time, but people who had kind of had their heads down in their own communities, it was a tremendous learning experience.
It's so interesting when you think from then to now, where we have not yet had an elected female president for America, and many other countries have women leaders and have had them for a long time. It makes you start wondering, like, gee, what is it in our education as American women in the 90s that made people so insular? We've got a question in the chat bar, which is wondering, what about the lack of media immediacy tools? How did the conversations that participants were having at this conference perhaps become deeper in some way, or maybe more thoughtful than what might have happened if people were constantly tweeting or twittering, or the media was interpreting what they were talking about? You definitely write about very long lasting relationships that grew from this conference.
Yeah, and people spoke a lot about it's something I think we're all kind of reckoning now with right at this moment, with the pandemic and isolation and things like that, and like kind of like return to normal, all of these things. People spoke a lot, and this all happened like before the pandemic, but a lot of the people I interviewed spoke a lot about the importance of just kind of like being in the same room with people, right? Hammering things out. It's a kind of situation where you would then like maybe like you would form a connection and then you go out for dinner afterwards with people, right? And you're like, but also like you're in a different country, maybe all of you. So there's like not just, so you're like form a connection in a tent, you're talking about things, and then you're all like figuring out where to go to dinner, figuring out how to get to dinner, figuring out how to order dinner, like all of this, and then trying new foods together, having like a kind of shared experience that is connected to this other stuff you're talking about feminism and social change, but is also just kind of like an amazing experience to be having with people in the world right now, and there is something about that shared connection, shared sense of community. People talked about the importance of meals, the importance of some people who were strategizing about the platform for action would be, kind of up late at night with people in their hotel rooms, drafting things, doing things together, and this kind of like person to person thing that they felt was really important. And it's interesting because several of the people that I talked with are also very involved in mentoring the next generation, right? And they said, and I kind of brought this up a little bit, like, what does that mean for our future? And they said, well, like the next generation, they feel they can connect in other ways that we don't, right? So I don't know that it's like necessarily we need to say like the golden age, and now that we don't do that, all is lost, but it really like, that's kind of like what that historical moment was. It was a lot about the importance of people coming. They would pay a lot of money, plane tickets, not just for these conferences, but for other kinds of events, to be there in person. And that felt really important to them, and like an important part of the connections that they were making that were really about trusting people in a different country and for them, it was crucial. A lot of it was that it was kind of face to face. You were there in struggle with someone else.
And your book really does, for people who read it, I'm not kidding when I say it would just be a very wonderful movie with lots of great parts for women, because you get the sense in the first part of your book of what it was like to be there. I'm so moved by your story about Madeleine Albright, which I'm not sure we have time for, but people should look for it because it's beautiful and very moving. But you talk then about kind of what grows during the conference and then what comes after in terms of coalition building. So an important part of your book that I found incredibly helpful for me personally with some of my advocacy work is thinking about the coalition building that took place between these different NGOs or non-governmental organizations that were advocating, because they met here, formed person-to-person friendships, and then brought that home and then formed alliances and coalitions. And one thing you said was, you were quoting someone else who said, wherever there's coalitions, there's conflict. And then you do a great job giving different examples of successes, I think we could call them, that came from coalitions, and then challenges. And I wondered not if you had a favorite conflict, but was there one of the cases that really stands out for you as a great case study for us to all think about in terms of the success and challenge of coalition building?
Yeah, it's something I really I emphasize so much when I teach about social movements, all social movements, particularly feminism, that there's often a sense that like, oh, if we're arguing like this, something's wrong, right? But it's like every social movement in history, like the history of the US at least, the idea that you're going to get all these kind of people who are passionate about social change together in a room and everyone's just going to agree, like it's just not, like if you think about it, like of course there's conflict in social movement, and that ideally, I mean, it's just about how you deal with it, right? Because ideally, like lots of people thinking different things, coming into a room trying to figure out what to do, like that's rich, that's like some rich stuff to go with. So the idea that, in the civil rights movement, full of conflict, right? I mean, like different ideas about which strategy is right and which is wrong. And often pursuing multiple strategies at the same time can be super effective. You see that with like the Black Panthers versus Martin Luther King, right? Like a kind of array of strategies that are deployed at the same time. And then that, and people on the radical edge, and then, the middle can kind of get through because there are these other people out there, right? So it, like the idea that everyone marks lockstep in a movement is really not how it actually works. Feminism though still, it's a part of the history that I think is hard to tell sometimes, right? Because it's not as fun to tell. One of the stories actually that I open the book with has to do with the Ms. Foundation, which really was, trying its best to organize organized a delegation of grassroots activists who were doing all kinds of really cool, amazing work in their communities around the entire US. And they organized a delegation to travel to Beijing together and kind of have this experience together, and then ideally like form a network that was going to be like the basis of a lot of social change when they got home. And if you look at the like who's who list on this list of Ms. Foundation grant, the people who came, it's a lot of people who made careers in feminism and social change, like a lot of people who you might, if you're kind of in the grassroots, you would know. And so they did, they were so concerned about having representation from different groups, like racial groups, ability, age, region, that they had like a spreadsheet and they like checked things off. Like, okay, this person checks these boxes, this one checks these boxes, right? Like it was like, we want this to be the most diverse group we can. And they brought them, they paid for them to go to Beijing. They all go over there on the plane, and they're all, and they get there, and it turned out that a lot of the people they had invited had thought really hard about how to kind of make inclusive spaces, how to center the voices of people who are most marginalized. And the Ms. Foundation started things off with kind of a bunch of white middle-class women, like in control, taking the lead, telling people what they were going to do. And it didn't go over well with these organizers. And in fact, what happened was there was a kind of schism that happened. And some of the women of color organizers ended up kind of taking over the entire orientation that the Ms. Foundation had planned. And, turning it into a site to do some anti-racist work. So that's an example of something that didn't go so well. And that's a lot because I think of the, it's like, and you see this repeatedly in my book, white middle-class women really wanting to kind of reach out to women of color, involve them in activities that they're doing, but they do it as like, I'm doing this thing and I'm going to invite you to it, rather than like, let's get together, have a few conversations, see if we have some shared priorities that we might want to work together on, right? It's a really different thing to just like invite someone to something you've already kind of planned, than to like actually like get to know them as people, develop a relationship, and then see what might happen from that, right? And so that was really very much an invite kind of culture that was happening among some feminist groups at that time. And it was a culture that a lot of women of color started saying no to, like, no, or like, no, I'm not going to be your one person on that panel. Like, if you want to invite me and my 3 other people I know who are like, who are also women of color, who also know about this to the panel, maybe we'll all come, but I'm not going to be your one person. And I'm not going to be your one person on a board. I'm just not going to do that anymore. So it's a real moment of reckoning, I think, for many organizations.
Well, the question the chat asks, and there's 2 things I think we should separate here. Why didn't the incredible energy from those who had attended the conference fuel a more vigorous stage for the feminist movement back home in the USA? And I would say, if you read the book, when you have a chance to read the book, I would say, I'm guessing, Lisa, you're going to say it did. Actually, it did fuel a really vigorous next step for feminism, but that the way we've kind of been taught through the media is that it didn't, that feminism kind of died, it went away, when in fact, it didn't.
Yeah. And so maybe, I think this really is going to lead really well into our next topic, which is, much of what we even, think about feminism in general, like kind of in the 20th century, I would say, has to do with like media images of what happened in the 1960s, right? So you think about like the protest against the Miss America pageant or something, like people out like waving signs, right? And it's like, if there's a march or a demonstration, like feminism is happening, is kind of, right? And if we don't see that happening, there is no feminism. Well, I mean, first of all, there were several huge marches in the 1990s, that about mostly around reproductive justice, reproductive rights. But like, even that aside, much of what was happening among feminist groups in the 90s wasn't about like sit-ins. It wasn't about marches. Much of it, and this is a huge transformation that happened, increasingly, a lot of activists are getting paid, right? So they're working in various kinds of nonprofits. They're opening their own nonprofits. They're getting grants. They're getting funding. There's more funding for feminism. And it kind of becomes a different kind of a movement, right? So you're more likely, there were a lot of longtime activists that were like, I am so tired from like working 9 to 5 or raising my kids and then at night going to meetings, right? Like that's just not sustainable over the long term. Like I want to get a job doing what I care about, right? I want to get a job that allows me to put my passions into action. And some people, it's like through the nonprofit sector. Other people kind of incorporate feminism into their work in different ways, like the increasing number of feminist lawyers. People like me who teach in universities, right? Like women's studies departments doing this kind of work, like kind of institutionalizing feminism. So feminism is happening in all of these places, but it's not necessarily a lot of people out there with signs. So they're different. And then there's a lot of really work happening at the grassroots, again, like kind of like really local organizing, like you're doing, really. And then also within other social movements. So feminists in the labor movement, feminists in the Latinx movement, like different feminists doing work within other movements. So it's happening in all kind of spaces, but it's not where the media is looking and not where many of us were looking, really.
And it seems like the women who return from the conference and stay in touch with each other and form alliances and seek out funding as a collective group instead of one organization looking for funding, but several groups working together. Or you talk about a case where Ford Foundation had a staff person, mentor / guide / help shape, putting people together. And I'm thinking about SisterSong in particular really stood out for me. So today happens to be a day where Arizona announced a new abortion ban, a 15-week abortion ban. And you mentioned reproductive justice in your book. And then the sort of contrast between SisterSong and maybe groups that people may or may not be more or less familiar with, like Planned Parenthood, NARAL. And I wonder if we might use that one as a little bit of an example to talk about how SisterSong brought lots of different groups together and found some real power there by forming a coalition approach, whereas say NARAL or Planned Parenthood were, individual groups, self-led.
Absolutely, yeah. So I mean, I think it's really interesting what SisterSong did because it found people organizations doing this kind of work all across the country, really. and brought them together at the table and said, okay, like, what can we do together? We can be stronger if we're working together in coalition. We can get grants, right? Big grants from the Ford Foundation to do this work. We can share strategies, but also like the things about like, these were like fledgling organizations, a lot of them. So it was like, we can learn together how to write good grant proposals. We can get one person to train us all up, right? You know, we can get one person to help us think about like what to do about a board, right? Like we can all get trained together on this stuff. We can so we're not all like expending our own resources to get information that we need, to get like actual resources like computers that we need to get, you know, like that we can kind of come together and do this together. And we're going to be a lot stronger if we adopt this kind of a model than if we're all doing like the same thing individually. So I think was a wonderful model. And they also had a real sense that they weren't going to get, it was a way to get respect from white-led feminist organizations like NARAL or NOW, right? You know, that like they had to amass some collective power in their own independent power base amongst themselves to then be able to kind of not just to be then say to, you know, these I was saying before, to these like more mainstream white-led organizations, like, well, we're going to kind of set some terms here if we're going to work together, right? You know, we're not going to just be thankful you're letting us on the stage at this big march that you're organizing in Washington, D.C. We're going to set some terms to say like, no, like we demand X and Y if you want us to be on your stage and you want to claim to have an inclusive movement, you're going to be like paying for buses for us to bring our people there kind of thing. So it was also like a way that they had more leverage within the movement itself.
And that word movement you talk about, I think that's so important, and definitely want to invite people at this point to definitely add things into the chat bar about your take on it. You know, in recent years, we've seen that phrase, women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, brought into the Women's March, which was a massive march. And you had incredible visibility across the country, across the globe. And so when people talk about, oh, feminism died, but it's like, your book lays out a very different take on it, which is that feminism was immersed across all kinds of different jobs and ways of using your daytime energy, whether you were paid or unpaid. And that when something happens like that kind of march, you suddenly see, oh, there's millions of people. Maybe they haven't been, as you put before, carrying signs, but they have been part of this lasting movement. So that word movement, I'm curious sort of how do you define it? How would you want to see students?
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, I think someone in the chat actually is like helping us think through this. Like, what does it mean to be part of a movement? What does it mean to be just like an individual organization, like doing its thing, right? And so like this, I mean, let's take the civil rights movement or even like feminism in the 60s or whatever, you know, like the women's movement of the 60s, like the women's movement in the 60s, there was no like one movement. That was like a lot of different organizations that together, you know, in retrospect, we say there was a women's movement, right? We say there was a civil rights movement, but there wasn't like one, like a Black civil rights movement, but there wasn't one group that was that. That was like a collection of people. And I, you know, when I was doing research for the book, there were some people who I ultimately decided weren't in my book. Like, you know, I did like a few oral history interviews where at the end I was like, well, I don't think this person's in my book because they're not in the movement. And one of the ways that because they were doing work for women, but they weren't connected to other people, right? They were kind of like one woman shows, or they had like an organization, but they just like kind of did their thing, right? And they weren't in some way connected to a broader collective, right? So I think it's that connection. Like you can be doing your work, right? But are you in conversation with other people? Are you in, and networking was the term they used in the 90s. Everything was about networking, right? It was all about this idea that we're going to build a network. We're going to build connections among each other. And they didn't like, we're not talking everyone's going out for dinner and having parties together or whatever, but it's just about like, you know, who's out there, you know who to contact, you know what's going on. You have a sense that what you're doing in your individual workspace or organization or whatever it is part of a broader whole. And that plays out in the fact that you aren't just an island, but you do have some kinds of connections with other people doing that work. Right. And so that's how and so there were some people who I did think, well, that's just kind of an individual organization. I don't know that they're part of like a broader movement that we have here. I will say, exactly. Change towards a goal. Well, I mean, that's like also really interesting because like, what is the goal, right? I mean, this is a perfect example of like the kinds of debates that still exist among feminists and have always existed and will continue to exist and are going to keep existing, right? Like, what is our goal? What are our main priorities? Like, these are things that people and movements fight about. We're still fighting about them, right? But if you're in the fight, you're part of the movement, right? Like, if you're in that conversation and you're like annoyed because someone's prioritizing X and you think they should be Y, and right now you like send a tweet about it, you're doing movement work. Like, that's being part of a movement. You're invested in what's happening here. So I think that's important. Let me just turn on my light. I'm sorry, everyone. It got a little bit, got a little bit dark over here.
That's darker, right? And definitely thank you for putting these comments in the chat. We really welcome them. It's easy to integrate comments here and have a conversation. Oh, that is so great. Yay, let's everyone.
Sorry about that. I don't, just the sunset. Hi.
One of the things that you talked about, several different places you wove it in, both in quoting other people and also in your observations, that real change takes generations. And so I think right now, I've interviewed a few people recently who are in their 70s, who were part of the feminist movement and are still part of the feminist movement, specifically again about reproductive rights, reproductive justice, I've been noticing the repetition of the phrase, oh, we dropped the ball. And it's doesn't seem fair to me. And so I'm always find myself saying, I don't think it's dropping the ball. I think on any issue, whether it's climate change or anything, people keep trying to move towards, as you put it, a goal. And, while you're working towards that goal, you keep moving forward some amount. But that big change takes many generations. It took more than 3 generations of women and men to be able to have women get the right to vote in federal elections, voting rights, to make sure that Black Americans can vote equally. That work's not done. So I'm wondering how you see intergenerational cooperation. Is that a coalition? Is it a movement? How do you think about that kind of transition?
Yeah, well, one of the things that was very surprising to me, because I think one of the narratives I often see about feminism is that there's, all of this intergenerational tension, right? And that's not to say it's not there, right? Like I did see parts of that. But what I saw when I saw tension tended to be more about politics than about generation, right? It was like where you stood on the issue, right? And like some of the most radical people I interviewed were, in their 60s, in their 70s, right? I mean, so it wasn't like the youngins are like the radical and what didn't split that way necessarily. I mean, it was really varied, and it often wasn't about generation. It was about politics, about your vision of the world, what your priorities are, what you think the strategies are we should use to make change. One of the things, though, I would also add in when we're thinking about this moment, like now, right, and like kind of like, well, like what happened, right, is success in a certain sense. When movements are successful, it produces an opposite reaction, right? And what we're seeing is like, in part, a reaction to the success of feminism, to the inroads that feminists were making, right? We're seeing tremendous opposition, not just towards feminists, right? Climate is another example, right? I mean, almost any issue, right? That like things have been like the force of opposition against us, I think, or against feminists cannot be discounted in this conversation, right? Like it's like very, very powerful. And talk about though like long-standing inroads and like planning and like grassroots activism over decades embedded, like the opponents of feminism have been doing that work. And you might say actually even more successfully at this moment, you could say, than feminists, because it certainly does seem that way.
Yeah, and
So
one of the
yeah.
comments earlier talking about media, I think the way media portrays what's really happening is huge. So if you were going to read about feminism through Ms. Magazine's framework, or Bitch Magazine is one that is listed in your introduction, which I have several copies of back here. But if you're reading it through, if feminist news media is telling the story, the way they monitor what's happening in the world looks completely different than commercial media outlets. So thank you for the person who put that comment about media in there earlier. I see there's a comment here too. I just want to get this out here and then I'll circle back to the prior comment. Saying educational climate change in the 90s took many forms, but it wasn't always labeled feminist. Daughters of this generation absorbed their mother's concerns and became the people who spoke up about sexual assault and harassment in Hollywood and gay rights. And you do take some time writing about the Me Too movement and different ways people have addressed sexual violence and violence against women in general. So I wonder if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Me Too movement was a really one of those moments when it was like, I mean, if you kind of followed that, even just like the Twitter and the kinds of ways that people were sharing stories, like in the early, I mean, I'm not even talking about, I mean, there's so many elements of the Me Too movement, right? You know, and like we know that it started like way before it kind of got a lot of attention by Tarana Burke, and like, you know, that like there's are these many dimensions of it, right? And then there's the Hollywood aspect of it. There's the kind of what's happening in workplaces. And then there was just kind of like the explosion of people, ordinary people sharing their stories, right? At that moment. Like it was powerful, powerful, powerful. And when you and when read and kind of, but all of it, it's like the analyses that people brought to the experiences that they had had in their lives were had been informed by feminist activism, because that I think is really the most successful element of feminist change, has been a kind of the effect on the culture, right? Like policies may not, like policies not as much, right? Like we got, like in the 1990s, there was a Family Medical Leave Act, childcare was about to happen, but like the Monica Lewinsky scandal actually like interrupted like a huge thing that was going to happen with childcare, right? So like in terms of like policies, but the ideas of feminism with the internet and everything, you know, and then with women's studies programs, with like all of the grassroots organizing, and as people are saying, with like mothers and daughters and conversations, right? The ideas become more prevalent. And then when, so that the Me Too outburst, it's like these ideas about like what's right and what's wrong and what's okay and what's not okay. And like, they didn't just come out of nowhere, right? Like this was, the ground had been tilled by decades and decades of feminist activism, you know, which just 5 decades previous or 4 decades previously had just named marital rape as a thing, right? Like it didn't, these sexual harassment, that idea didn't exist until the 70s. Like feminists invented it, right? I mean, like the term didn't exist, right? And so, and it's like these ideas become more and more prevalent till this moment when something happens and they spark, right? Same thing we can think about with Black Lives Matter. It seems like a movement sprung up. No, like people have been working in grassroots organizations for decades, waiting for this moment, and then it happens, right? Women's March, same thing. You know, it doesn't, people don't just show up. They showed up because they had learned and been thinking about feminist ideas.
Well, and that it circles back into thinking back about that conference, because you talk a little bit about the different conferences that had happened. It's not just like there's one UN conference. There were many conferences and a lot of different people working very hard to have women and quote women's issues be discussed, so that in theory, as you described it, if people miss that, there's like you go to the conference zone and there's over here the fancy delegates and over here the activists, and the activists are trying to get the attention of the delegates to put things into the platform that will then be taken home to all the country's leaders, so that the activists are trying to move the needle forward. And that's something I didn't fully understand, but suddenly, you know, you have Hillary Clinton speaking, media picks it up, suddenly people all know about that UN conference, but not necessarily the very, very hard work that had been done by many people for many years. And you take us through the stories of some of those women who worked like just like a lion's share of work done, very slow, methodical organizing to get there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's our understanding of what it, I mean, I think this conversation is just itself so enlightening in so many ways, right? You know, like we say movement, we say like social change, and we think of, we don't, there's so much to be learned by looking at the kind of like nitty gritty stuff that it takes to actually get stuff done. I mean, Jessie, you're such a good example of that. Like, what does it take to get a statue, right? Like, I mean, you know, I mean,
Right.
like people are just going to see it, like, hopefully, right? You know, 20 years from now, people are like, oh, that's really cool. But it's like, no, like that was the product of like a really sustained organizing campaign that had like multiple dimensions, including you being here tonight with your background, like, you know, kind
Right.
of like letting
Right.
people know. I think it's so awesome, right? You know, like has like all of these different dimensions to it. Like I'm sure there's a media strategy, like there's just like all of this part. And like, but we don't, that's not like a story necessarily that has cachet, right? Especially
Right.
in our world today, right? You know, that like we're gonna have like it, that it's like, but those stories are so crucial to understand, for people to understand how change actually happens, the hard work of change, the slog of change, the compromises necessary to, you know, get in a room of people who all are going to have their own things, right? You know, like all of this stuff that is actually needed, and the tremendous work to get like a little bit of change, right?
Yeah, I'm going to echo on that exactly, because our community is working on building this monument, which would go here in this historic empty lawn space here. But we did not think in 2020, March 8th, 2 years ago, it would take the amount of time and effort it's taken. But it requires all the same things that you detail in your book. It takes coalition building. It takes having a strategy. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes a ton of nitty gritty work. But
Yeah.
what we discovered was we're didn't realize it because we were just, you know, doing our thing in our community. It turns out it is a little bit of a monument building moment, because it turns out there's sort of two approaches to looking at the generally racist, sexist, white, male dominated monuments across the country. And a group called Monument Lab has done a national inventory, because they got, as you put in your book, a lot of money. They got $500 million, which helped them suddenly have staff to audit the monuments. And what they learned is fewer than 7% of monuments across the country include women. Fewer include women of color. So you start realizing, oh, it's not just our, you know, many different communities are thinking, we don't want to tear down the monuments in Lexington, but we do want to have more inclusive monuments that are not just white men. And so what do? So you don't really know which part of something you're in. And you also don't know, as you point out, how many people have even thought about it, because we've just grown up in a country where basically there's white men in monuments. That's what we expect to see. So if you walk through a town, you probably don't say, oh my God, there were no women, because they're not anywhere. And so, you know, it seems like a very simple change, given that other issues I work on are more like reproductive rights, which is a much broader issue. But feminists are doing work in all kinds of ways. The other thing it made me think about is you talk quite a bit about the labor movement as well. This book really, I just want to say, one-stop shopping. If you want to connect some dots between the last 10, 15 years, it's very interesting thinking about the larger organizations, the smaller groups, who has the money, who has the power, where they get it. And it's a fascinating look, really. For those who are writing the comment bar, highly encourage taking a look. I want to just ask you a couple questions as we run down towards the last minute. So if other people have questions, definitely put them in the chat bar here. But as you think about the different women who you interviewed, are there people who really stand out for you as people who just set an amazing example that you personally have found echoes in your own work?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you that like almost every interview that I did with these activists changed me in some way or another, right? Like really, really. And, you know, I talked about the word humble for how people felt, US activists felt when they went to Beijing. And that was really, I would say, the experience I had, you know, because I'm a professor, right? I teach women's history. I like know feminist theory, all of this stuff, right? And then to see how people were using these kinds of, like, to see, first of all, like the level of analysis of these activists and the kind of level of thinking and analysis that they were doing. Like, they were operating on just like a completely, it was just very humbling for me to do these interviews and to see how much I learned from each of them. You know, I think that some of my favorite issues, some of my most, well, actually, like, so many of the interviews were very moving, right? I mean, one of them though was with the interviews I did with the women with disabilities who traveled to Beijing, and they brought women with disabilities from around the US, met with women who have disabilities from around the world. They had like a kind of pre-conference conference for them that these the people I interviewed organized, right? And they talked about what it was like just even to travel over to China at the time. And they arrive at the airport, and you know, they're in wheelchairs. Some of them are blind, some of them are deaf, some of them have canes, like, you know, just a wide variety of women with disabilities who are coming over there. And they get to where they have to go to customs, and the elevator is broken. And there's like all of these wheelchairs, all of these people in canes, right? And they're like, and the Chinese authorities are like, sorry, you have to go down these 2 flights of stone stairs. And they're like, well, no, like, look at us, like, we can't do that. And they said, no, And meanwhile, there's like a working elevator, like, right there, but it's officially in China. And so if you haven't gone through customs, you can't use it. Anyway, so like, they're like and they ended up like carrying each other down the stairs, crawling down the stairs, just incredible stories just to get to the customs. And then it turns out that like that was just kind of a preview of their entire experience at the conference, which was completely inaccessible. They are like scheduled to present at panels that have 3 flights of stairs, right? You know, like no elevators. They're like, there was a disability tent, and that tent is like way out from the entrance. And meanwhile, it's raining and there's mud everywhere. You can't get a wheelchair through, right? Like, I mean, it was just like one thing after another. But like the really interesting thing about it was that they're like trying to go places in buses, but the buses don't have strap downs for the wheelchair. So everyone's rattling around. Like, I mean, it's like unbelievable. But like what they talked about is like, there was this way that this hardship that they went through together created these tremendous bonds. So it's not to say that it was okay, but like that experience together was like going through it together. They ended up creating their own hub in the disability. They were like, well, we can't get anywhere at the conference, so people are gonna have to come to us. And the disability tent became this like tremendous site that people would go to, and they were teaching people how to make wheelchairs out of bikes and doing all of this stuff, you know, and like talking with each other, educating each other on reproductive rights and childbirth and all of the stuff it became this kind of like, through hardship, it really became a hub of activism and networking and community building. And Bella Abzug was there in a wheelchair as well. And she came to the disability tent and delivered a speech there. So, I mean, it's turned into this tremendous story. And so, you know, those kinds of stories, they stay with you. They really do.
It's a beautiful book. It's a practical guide as well. And it's a fantastic history lesson. It's like history at its best because it's useful, it's engaging, it's inspiring. And I really appreciated reading the book. I encourage people who are listening to pick up a copy at the library. If you don't order it if you can. And it's just been lovely to get to meet you in this way.
Oh, it was really wonderful. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, Jessie. And thanks to everyone in the audience, and feel free to be in touch. It's really wonderful to be in this conversation. I appreciate the invitation. And good luck with the monument. You'll have to let me know.
Definitely let you know. Thank you so much. And Matt, thanks so much for keeping us organized. And thank you to the Lexington League of Women Voters for sponsoring tonight, and for all the donors who give to Carey Memorial